I know a lot goes into property tax and calculations and everything, but if, in your simplest terms, could you kind of give the idea behind the 3% cap and how you think that will work in the budget while providing the property tax relief Nebraskans need?
Yeah, in our budget, we've got $1.36 billion over the biennium in property tax relief. But to ensure it goes into people's pockets and not just in more local government spending, we want to put a constitutional amendment together, Senator Linehan and I, that would limit the tax askings, or the amount of taxes that local governments can ask from somebody, to a growth rate of 3% a year, which is very reasonable. We would have exceptions for things such as bonds voted on by the people. People could override that, or just growth. If you had just real growth, it would go over that. That'd be fine as well. And the idea is to not only make sure that we're protecting the people and that the tax relief goes to their pockets, but really also, if the legislature fails to enact and work on this, then at some point the people are mad about this. They're going to do it on their own. And in the 1960s, what that meant is the voters stripped the state of our authority to levy property taxes. You could imagine that down the road the people will act and strip local governments of their authority to levy property taxes.
And in addition to that, is there anything else you can say to school board members? Because of course a lot of people are a little bit scared from the cap. Do you think it's a case where they're spending too much, or just the cost of education is rising, and then how do they kind of deal with this proposed budget?
Well, as I travel around the state, I look at a lot of school budgets, and some school districts do a very good job of controlling their spending to keep it under the 3%, and some other districts not so much. And so really what we're trying to do is say that you can only ask so much of your taxpayers with this, that you've got to manage within your budget, just like we've been doing at the state. I mean, our biennial growth across these 2 years is going to average 1.5%, which is half of what we're asking local governments to do. And if you look over the last 10 years, property taxes, those local property taxes have grown by 4.46% on average over 10 years. And that's just not sustainable. Our families just can't manage it within their budgets anymore.
And sticking with the 3%, you look at the scope of Omaha and a 3% cap as opposed to, a town like Albion and what that might mean for that community. How do you feel this could potentially impact the smaller communities or rural communities that don't have that big population base?
Well, again, if you don't have a bigger population base, you also don't have as many expenses either. So again, the 3% is very reasonable to be able to manage and operate under, and it doesn't preclude local government from looking for other opportunities. It doesn't say anything about sales tax or if you get in federal aid or anything like that. So it doesn't mean that you're losing all your forms of revenue. It just means you cannot keep raising your property taxes so much year after year after year.
And a last one on property tax. There was a taxpayer petition drive aimed at lowering property taxes, which failed. Would you support that if that was to come up again on the 2022 ballot?
Well, I think the thing to do for the legislature is to act upon the proposal that Senator Linehan and I have and put it in front of the voters proactively. Again, this is where, in my speech, I said, if the legislature doesn't act, the people will. I think it's best the legislature acts and puts together a thoughtful proposal onto the ballot that then people can then vote on.
And moving ahead, to Sunday, and obviously it's been a lot in the national landscape, and you were asked about it earlier this week. In terms of Nebraska specifically, have you changed how you feel about when you were asked, Monday and Tuesday about the situation here in the Capitol, or you've reached out to the State Patrol and the National Guard and feel still confident in what may or may not happen on Sunday?
Well, we are certainly monitoring the situation with regard to any planned protests. We always do. And we have appropriate steps in place to be able to handle those, and that's what we're going to do. We've got appropriate resources with both the State Patrol and the National Guard, and we'll manage this. And we have protests here at the Capitol all the time. We expect protesters to be peaceful, but we're prepared in case they're not.
And you were pressed pretty hard about the Second Amendment right, and you saying, yes, open carry rather will still be allowed at the Capitol, not going to do anything about that. And I'm just wondering, and that's a right that Americans have, do you feel that right could potentially jeopardize the safety of others for those to exercise that in a situation like this?
Well, again, we have a constitutional right. It was embedded in our Constitution, and we have seen many of our rights being infringed upon over the years. And that's why I continue to make sure that we defend our constitutional rights, all of them, whether it's going to be the free speech rights of protesters to protest, or the right of people to be able to keep and bear arms, and open carry is part of that right. So we're going to defend all those rights.
You were asked about, the president and if, he did or didn't incite the stuff that took place at the nation's capital. I think you still stick by the fact that everyone's responsible for their own decisions, or have you, changed your mind in terms of what might have contributed to that event?
The president had asked people to march peacefully. Every one of those protesters who broke the law did that of their own volition, right? They were responsible. They made the choice to break the law. They knew what they were doing was wrong, and so they need to be held accountable for it.
And as a leader like the president, what role, if any, do you feel leaders have in helping control people's decision-making process, or allowing them to act a certain way?
Well, again, leaders can help shape people's opinion about policies, but actions are driven by individuals. People make those decisions to take those actions, and they need to be held accountable for their actions. That's what we believe in this country, personal responsibility. And so each and every one of those people who broke the law did it because they decided to do it. They made the choice to do it. That's their choice. They need to be held accountable.
And big quick picture question as a part of it, is there anything that could have been done, or how do you feel we could have avoided a situation like we saw at DC, and then also back to this summer as well, from a higher level, if you will? Was there things that could have been done to help prevent those types of incidents?
We can always do better, but we need people to understand that it's the American way to protest, but it's got to be a peaceful protest. Whether it's a Black Lives Matter event in Omaha or Lincoln, where we saw violence, that was their choice. Those people who committed that violence last summer, that was their choice to start that violence. Same thing was true for the Capitol. People make individual choices, they need to be held accountable.
Bringing it local, we had armored vehicles, tanks kind of going down, Omaha when we had the summer riots, and then less of a scene in DC. Is that surprising to you for that instance, that you saw a difference in response, or the severity in the response of what was going on?
Well, you may recall that in the protests we had last summer, we did not have a big presence there on the first night, as our presumption is that people are going to behave peacefully and protest peacefully. When you saw more of the presence with regard to, say, the heavier vehicles and so forth, that was after, and even the National Guard. We didn't call it the National Guard until after people started demonstrating they were going to be violent. So I guess it's not having that there is not necessarily surprising, given that I think generally we want to let people have their First Amendment right to be able to protest. And then if they abuse that, then you take the actions to be able to slow that down. Obviously, you want to be prepared. And again, I'm not familiar with all the things what the preparations were in Washington, D.C. That's part of the investigation that will happen.
And fairly broad question, as we prepare for Inauguration Day and Trump wrapping up his 4 years, can you say from your opinion what you felt that he did right, and then what you felt he did wrong, if anything?
Well, I would certainly say that if you look over the last 4 years, and we've had a challenging time working our way through the pandemic, that's certainly been a challenge, and there was just a lot of things we didn't know with regard to that. But if you look at the accomplishments, when you look back on the lowest unemployment rate that we've ever had, and especially true for African Americans, Asian Americans, Hispanic Americans, more Americans working in their time, the income inequality gap shrinking for the first time in literally decades. You look at the steps the president took to be able to address our trade issues with our partners who have been taking advantage of us, the way he decimated ISIS in the Middle East and stood up to our enemies overseas. The president had a lot of very good policies that made this country stronger. Certainly, here as we it's ended poorly with that attack in the Capitol, but there are a lot of things that happened during the Trump administration that benefited everyday Americans.
And with that being said, obviously Biden taking over, a switching of the parties, do you feel optimistic about the country's future and where it's heading? I know it may be hard to say, or do you have some trepidation about the new administration?
Well, I'm always optimistic. I always think that as Americans we can pull together and overcome the challenges we face. I'd certainly encourage the next administration to reach out and develop good relationships with the governors, especially if you think about managing an emergency like this pandemic. We have to work our way through this pandemic. It's going to take several more months, and emergencies in this country, such as we're in right now, are handled at the local level. It is locally executed, state managed, federally supported. That's still true. So it's important that the Biden administration, if for no other reason than managing through this pandemic, reach out and develop good relationships with the states, the governors of the states, so that we can continue to have that effective pandemic response.
And from your perspective, have you been reached out to yet, or how do you envision that you will work with the Biden administration?
The Biden transition team did reach out to me to give me a heads up about what the president-elect was going to talk about in his speech as far as further pandemic relief. And I encourage them to develop those good relationships with the governors, because that's going to be very important, I think, to have a successful conclusion to our pandemic response.